a theory and a hypothesis, but we're also going to talk about a voyage that Darwin made and the conclusion that he was able to draw from that voyage. So before we get started with this, I want to remind you guys that remember during the time of Linnaeus, when the classification system came out, when he came out with that classification system, remember that people thought that species did not ever change. The scientific thought was that species do not ever change. So Darwin came and he blew this idea out of the water and he said, no, you guys are wrong. Species do change. And that's what we call evolution. So we're going to take a look at Darwin's theory today. And before we start with Darwin's theory, I want to comment one more thing. So on your calendar for today, I had given you guys something about, let me find it, something about a natural selection exercise, and I'm not actually going to have you guys do that. So I just wanted to let you know that that will not be posted. I've not posted it yet. I will not be posting it. I don't feel like there's a good exercise for you guys to understand natural selection as much as us just talking about it. So we're going to go ahead and talk about Darwin's theory today. Keeping in mind that a theory starts out as a hypothesis, and then we have to do a lot of research and proving to turn that hypothesis into a theory. So we're going to move on, and we're first going to talk about Darwin. So remember, in our lesson yesterday, I told you guys that Darwin was a British naturalist. So Darwin was you could say a scientist, not really a scientist, but he really enjoyed nature. He enjoyed observing things in nature. And so he was from England and he was a naturalist. So he would go out in nature and observe things. And in England, what he observed was that species didn't really change. There wasn't much difference between, for example, let's say birds. There wasn't much difference between birds in England of the same species. So we could say, for example, blue jays. All the blue jays looked exactly the same. There were no difference between the blue jays. So Darwin also thought that species did not change over time. But in 1831, he went out on a voyage, and this voyage was to travel around the world for 5 years on a boat called the HMS Beagle. So the HMS Beagle left from England in 1831, and Darwin spent 5 years traveling around the world on that HMS Beagle. And what Darwin saw on his voyage was completely different than what he had ever seen before in his life. He saw diversity of living things. And by diversity of living things, what I mean is, for example, he saw giant tortoises in one area of South America, and then he saw giant tortoises in another area of South America. And he noticed, even though they were the same species, they looked quite different. And he was confused about why they looked different. Why was there a need for them to look different? And so remember, there was this idea that there was no diversity. Things do not change over time. They stay exactly the same. And so in order for Darwin to present to the public this idea of diversity and things changing over time, he needed to have a lot of evidence to support this idea. So he set out on this voyage and he started to see diversity, and he needed to collect all of this information about diversity before he could actually present it to the public. So even though Darwin did see diversity, what we understand today is that there is even more diversity than Charles Darwin could have ever possibly imagined. So today we see that there are 1.6 million different species on Earth. 1.6 million species have been discovered. And that's not to say that new species are not being discovered every day. But what we see is diversity among species, meaning even though we can say that all of the, let's say, trying to think of a species, let's say all of the zebras. So even though we can say zebras are a species, not all of the zebras within that species look exactly the same. There is some diversity between the zebras within that species. So that's what we're talking about today. There are ways that they look different. So I want to remind you that a species is a group of similar organisms that can mate and produce offspring that also have the ability to reproduce. So remember, organisms that are not in the same species cannot mate and produce offspring that have the ability to reproduce. So remember, we talked about the liger. So that's a lion and a tiger. They are in different species, And so even though they can reproduce to produce a liger, that liger does not have the ability to reproduce. It is considered sterile or infertile, meaning it cannot reproduce. So if you want to continue having ligers in the population, you need to continue breeding lions and tigers, or those ligers will die out because they cannot reproduce. So species have the ability to mate and produce offspring that also have the ability to reproduce. So that is the scientific definition of a species. And I have put this picture of Darwin's finches. So Darwin is really famous for his finches. And we're going to go into a lot more detail about the finches later on in this presentation because they were really important to his discovery of diversity in living things. Okay, so there's your bit of information about Charles Darwin. When I was in graduate school, actually, fun fact, my advisor, so her name was Dr. Latham, and she's the one who sent some students to talk to us in class when we were in school about forensic anthropology. Her son's name is Lucas Darwin Beach. So she actually named her son after Charles Darwin. So that's a fun fact. Charles Darwin is very, very important in the world of evolution, and a lot of people really admire and look up to him. So that is an example of someone being a huge fan of Charles Darwin. Okay, so Darwin also observed diversity in terms of fossils. So remember that fossils are the preserved remains of plants and animals that died a long time ago. And fossils can tell us a lot about a species. So what Darwin saw in terms of the fossils that he was able to observe was that there was variation even in terms of the fossils. So this picture over here that you're seeing is probably not real, but it is the idea is real. So what you're seeing here is the skeletal remains of a giant sloth. And so today we know that sloths are really slow moving, they're really small creatures, and I don't know why they're so slow moving. They don't have a lot of energy. Their food sources don't provide them with a lot of energy, and so they can't move at very fast speeds. Anyway, we know that today sloths are quite small. Well, Darwin found remains or bones, fossilized remains of giant sloths. So he saw variation even in terms of fossils. So what he saw is that over time, the sloths became smaller. And he wondered how this was possible if species did not ever change over time. So remember, there was this idea that species don't change over time. So Darwin wondered how that was even possible, how this was even possible. How could he find remains of a really big sloth? And today we have sloths that are much smaller if species did not ever change over time. So even in terms of the fossils that Darwin was seeing, he was seeing variation, meaning they did not all look the same. So he came to this conclusion after visiting the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos Islands are along South America, and I probably should have put a map in here for you guys to see the Galapagos Islands, but there are many of them. So the HMS Beagle stopped along the coast of South America several times at these different Galapagos Islands. And Darwin noticed a lot of variation, not only between the organisms living on the different Galapagos Islands, but also between the organisms that were living on mainland South America. So he noticed variation between these organisms, and he came to the realization that species don't always stay the same, meaning they change over time. And he drew the conclusion that the reason that they change over time is because they need to adapt to their environment in order to be better suited for that environment. Because what we know is that species who live in environments that they are not well suited to will quickly die out. So for example, if for some reason polar bears migrated to Indiana, they would not be able to survive because it is not cold enough in Indiana for them to survive. And there would not be enough adaptation taking place within the polar bear species quickly enough for them to survive, meaning adaptations take long periods of time. They are not rapid. It takes place over hundreds of years, even millions of years. So what we see is that some organisms are not able to adapt fast enough to survive in different environments. So what Darwin was seeing in terms of the Galapagos organisms was that these animals who were living in South America at some point migrated to the Galapagos Islands. So let's say we have Galapagos Island A and Galapagos Island B. There are many of them, but let's just say that. And let's say that we have iguanas, because I have pictures of iguanas here. And those iguanas somehow got from mainland South America to the Galapagos Islands. But on one Galapagos Island, it's more tropical and warmer and nicer than on another Galapagos Island. On the other Galapagos Island, there are more predators for the iguanas. So what we see is that these iguanas who have moved from mainland South America to these Galapagos Islands need to adapt to the changed environment on those islands compared to the mainland South America in order to survive. So the iguanas living on the island where there are more predators need to very quickly change color and blend into their surroundings so that they are not eaten by those predators. Whereas the iguanas living on the other island where there are not predators, but there are, it's really tropical and it's really nice for the iguanas, they don't necessarily need to change color. They don't need that ability. So maybe they lose that ability to change color over time. So they're still iguanas, but they lost that ability to change color. Whereas the iguanas on the other island have to change color or they will very quickly die out because they're going to get eaten. So we see these changes of species traveling to different environments and having to adapt to those environments. And that's what Darwin was seeing. So he came to this realization that species don't always stay the same, that they adapt to their environment better over time to become better suited to that environment. Because we know that they have to become better suited to that environment in order to survive and reproduce. So that idea is natural selection, and we're going to take a look at natural selection in more detail today. So I want to point out that this iguana on the bottom picture here, which you see is less colorful than the iguana on the top, is from mainland South America. And then the iguana on the top, which is very colorful and spiky, he is from the Galapagos Islands. So you can see how this iguana has changed over time to be better suited to its surroundings in different environments. Okay, so I told you that we were going to come back to Darwin's finches, and so I want to do that really quickly. So while Darwin was touring on the HMS Beagle around South America and all around the world, what he noticed was that there were different finches on the different islands of the Galapagos. And what he noticed about those finches is that they had different beak sizes in terms of shortness and thickness and whether they were hooked or long or narrow. And he observed that such adaptations were necessary for the food that they were eating. So for example, in this first picture here, we see a short, really thick beak. And Darwin observed that that short, really thick beak was necessary for crushing seeds. So that adaptation was necessary for that finch to survive in that environment because the food that was available to that finch was seeds. So they had to adapt their beaks so that they could eat those seeds and their beaks would not break or what have you. So those are the short, thick beaks, and those are necessary for crushing those seeds that were available to the birds at that time. And then in number 2 over here, we have a narrow pointed beak. And that narrow pointed beak allows that finch to pluck insects out of the ground. So it can pluck at the ground and pull those insects out, maybe worms or bugs or whatever, and eat those insects as its food. So it needed a narrow pointed beak in order to get its food, those insects within the ground. So that's a second adaptation of the finch. And then down here we have number 3. And number 3 is short hooked beaks. And Darwin observed that those short hooked beaks were necessary for eating fruit. So on one Galapagos island, the only food source of the finch was fruit. So it needed a short hooked beak in order to eat the fruit. And then finally, the 4th adaptation that Darwin noted in terms of the finches is that some of them had long, pointed, sharp beaks. And this was so that they could eat cacti. So they had to be able to get their beaks into the cacti to take the nutrients out of the cacti, and they needed long, pointed, sharp beaks in order to do this. So Darwin noted these differences between the beaks of the finches. So it was one species, but they all had different beaks. And they adapted their beaks to the food that they were able to find on that particular island. So Darwin noticed not only that all of these finches were different on the islands, but they were also different from the mainland finches. So we're seeing that organisms have to adapt in a lot of different ways, not only to the environment, but also to the food that they're able to eat. So in some areas, some food might be available, and in other areas, it might not. So then organisms have to adapt to eating different food altogether. So that's one of the things that we see in terms of adaptations. And adaptations are those changes that occur over time so that organisms become better able to live in their environment. Okay, so Darwin made a hypothesis. After his voyage on the HMS Beagle, Darwin was convinced that species do change over time. And that idea of species changing over time is what we call evolution. So a lot of people have this idea that evolution is that humans came from monkeys. That's not the idea. The idea is simply that species change over time, meaning that if we look far back in the past, we see that those species look completely different than they look today. And there are a lot of reasons for those changes to occur. And so when we're talking about humans, which we'll do later on, we see that humans have changed in a lot of ways from the past to the present, not only in terms of brain size and body size and our ability to do things like make tools and all those things, but in lots of different ways. So Darwin hypothesized that species change over many generations to become better adapted to new conditions. And Darwin's hypothesis eventually became a theory. And remember that a theory is a well-tested idea. It's something that has been tested multiple times, and it explains a wide range of observations. So that's why Darwin needed all of these observations from the Galapagos Islands and mainland South America and all around the world to prove that his hypothesis was indeed factual. So remember, a hypothesis is a question that we're trying to answer, yes or no. When we prove that hypothesis is true, we have to continue to test it to make sure that we get the same answer every single time. And once it has been tested so many times and proven to be true, it becomes a theory, meaning it is a fact. So a hypothesis is just a question, and a theory is a fact that explains a wide range of observations. So we need lots of observations for a hypothesis to become a theory. So Darwin's hypothesis became a theory, and he said that species change over many generations to become better adapted to new conditions. So we need to understand what this means now. So I want to think about this in terms of something that we call artificial selection. And Darwin was trying to prove his hypothesis that species change over time, but he was trying to say why. So Darwin really liked birds, so he bred pigeons, and he bred his pigeons based on certain characteristics that he wanted to see in the new population of pigeons that would reproduce. So this is known as artificial selection, and we do this with domesticated animals. And a really great example of artificial selection in terms of domesticated animals are dog breeds. So we breed dogs for characteristics that we like. So for example, let's see, the poodle and the golden retriever mix, the golden doodle. We have chosen to breed those two dogs together because we like the temperament of the golden retriever, and we like that the poodle is hypoallergenic, meaning it doesn't cause people allergies. So someone thought, well, if we breed the poodle and the golden retriever, then their offspring are going to be hypoallergenic and have a really great behavior. So that was that idea behind that artificial selection. We chose two behaviors that we really liked, and we put them together into the same dog in hopes that they would have those behaviors. That one dog would have both of those behaviors. So artificial selection is this idea that we take organisms with desired characteristics and we breed them. We like the hair of one dog and we like the behavior of the other dog, so we breed them together so that we get a dog with the really nice hair and the really nice behavior. So Darwin thought that this process was similar, that there was a process that was similar to artificial selection that was occurring in nature, so that some organisms were better able to adapt to their environment, were better able to survive in their environment, and also reproduce. And that's this idea of natural selection. So natural selection is this idea that organisms that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce than other organisms. And so Darwin identified several factors that actually affect natural selection. And we're going to talk about those ideas today, or those factors. So the factors include overproduction, variation, competition, selection, environmental change, and genes. And we're going to go into a lot more detail in each of these factors in our coming chapters of our book. But this is just kind of an introduction to natural selection for you guys. So I put this picture up here of giraffes. And it's this idea long ago, they decided that giraffes have long necks because of natural selection. So what they said is that giraffes originally had short necks. And because their food sources were up high in the trees, they had to stretch really tall to get their food sources. And so that made their necks grow longer. And they passed that gene on to their offspring. And so now giraffes have long necks. And what we know today is that that's not the reason that giraffes have long necks. That's not even almost the truth. But that was the idea of natural selection. And so we don't see natural selection acting in that way today, but we do see that natural selection causes organisms, makes it so that organisms that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive than organisms who are not as well adapted to their environment. And if organisms that are well adapted to their environment can survive, then they can also reproduce and produce organisms that are also well adapted to their environment. And that's what we're going to look at in these next couple of slides. All right, so the first factor that affects natural selection is this idea of overproduction. So what we know is that most species on Earth produce more offspring than can actually survive. So for example, snakes lay hundreds of eggs, and we know that not all of those snakes survive. We know that rabbits give birth to, let's say, 16 bunnies. That's not true. It's less than 16. It's like 8 or 10. Okay, they give birth to 8 or 10 bunnies, and not all of those bunnies are going to survive. And the reason is because there's not enough food sources available for all of those bunnies, there's not enough living space for all of them, and there's not enough water. So overproduction really kind of helps or is a factor in terms of natural selection, meaning that only some of those rabbits are going to survive. And only some of those rabbits are going to be well suited to their environments, meaning only some of them are going to reproduce. And being well suited to their environment, they're going to pass that gene on to their offspring. So overproduction, natural selection can act on overproduction. So for example, we see that lots of these rabbits are brown and some of them are white. And this is not to highlight that some of them are not going to survive. This is to highlight that some of those rabbits are going to be better suited for their environment. So let's say that one rabbit had all of these rabbits, and so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of her offspring were white and the rest were brown. And they lived in the woods, not in a snowy environment. And so those white rabbits are going to get eaten very quickly because they stick out in a forest setting. Whereas if these rabbits lived in snowy conditions, those white rabbits would survive and the brown rabbits would not, because the brown rabbits would be spotted in the snow very quickly and they would get eaten. So it's this idea of overproduction, meaning that nature has to act on this overproduction. There's not enough food for all of these organisms. There's not enough living space, and there's not enough water. So nature has to act on these organisms in order to kind of shrink the population down. And that's this idea of natural selection, meaning some organisms are better adapted to their surroundings than others are, and they're going to survive, and the ones that are not as well adapted are not going to survive. So I only have about 5 minutes left on my recording, and I know I'm getting over time with you guys, so I'm going to hurry through this. So we also have the factor of variation. So that means that members of a species differ from one another in terms of their traits. And the differences between the species are what we call variation. So for example, if you were to look at turtles, sea turtles can differ in lots of different ways. They can be different colors. They can be different sizes. Some of them are better able to swim compared to others. And also some have harder shells than others. So we see all of these variations between organisms within the same species, and those variations are either going to make them better suited for their environment or not as well suited for their environment. And natural selection is going to kill off the ones that are not as well suited to their environment. So it's this idea that organisms that are very well suited to their environment are going to be favored in nature, and they're going to survive and reproduce offspring that are also well suited to their environment. In terms of competition, members of a species must compete with each other for survival because resources are limited. And when I say resources are limited, I mean things like food, water, and living space. So competition means that organisms of the same species are going to compete against each other for these things. And some are going to be better suited to that competition, and they're going to survive and reproduce, while others are not. And so we have this natural way of shrinking down populations within the animal kingdom. We also have selection. So some variations allow species to be better adapted to their environment, and better adapted individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce. So offspring inherit those helpful characteristics. So for example, we see again these rabbits over here. We see 2 brown rabbits, and they had 5 babies. 3 of their babies are also brown. 1 is a little bit reddish, and 1 is orange. So in that environment, the bunnies that are brown, the light brown color, are going to survive and reproduce, while the other 2 are not, because their fur color is not well adapted to the environment that they live in, meaning predators are going to be able to see them better, and they're going to kill them off before they're able to reproduce. And so this idea of natural selection is that organisms survive to their reproductive years and then are able to reproduce to produce offspring that are also well adapted to their environment. So Darwin proposed that over long periods of time, natural selection can cause change, meaning the environment causes organisms to change over time to become better suited to such an environment. So that's the idea of selection. And then we also have this idea of environmental change, or this factor of environmental change in terms of natural selection. So changes in environmental conditions can affect an organism's ability to survive. It can cause natural selection to take place. So when I was thinking about environmental change, we have this really great representation of mice here. So there's a new population of mice that's moved into the area. Some of them are black and some of them are white, and the ground is dirt, so it's black. And so the mice that are black are going to survive, and the mice that are tan are going to get eaten by the hawks. So those black mice are going to survive and reproduce into the next generation, giving us another generation of primarily black mice, because those tan mice did not survive. They did not survive to be able to reproduce because they got eaten. So it's this idea of environmental change that can cause natural selection. Natural selection occurs because some organisms are not as well adapted to their environment as others are, and so they cannot survive to reproductive years and reproduce offspring. So ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, how does natural selection actually act on organisms? How are these traits actually passed on to organisms? So variation means that not all individuals have the ability to survive and reproduce. Variations can result from changes in genes, and we're going to talk a lot about genes later on. But genes are passed on from parent to offspring. So there is the gene for eye color, for example, and maybe your dad has brown eyes and your mom has green eyes and you got brown eyes. So you got that trait, that gene from your father. And then in terms of hair color is another gene. So your mom has red hair and your dad has brown hair, and your mom passed her red hair on to you. So genes are passed on from parent to offspring, and only genes that are inherited can be acted upon by natural selection. Meaning natural selection can only act upon genes or things that are inherited, such as hair color or eye color or height or shell hardness in terms of turtles or whatever. So we're talking about traits that are genes that can be inherited from one generation to the next. And that is what natural selection can act upon. So behavior can be a gene that's passed on. So behavior can be acted upon. eye color, hair color, height, weight, shell hardness. Those types of things are the only things that natural selection can act upon. So